Rain hammered against Ethan Brooks's windshield as the clock on his dashboard flashed 7:42 p.m. 22 minutes late for a blind date he never wanted in the first place. His jaw tightened, while his daughter's tiny voice still echoed in his head from the phone call minutes earlier. "Don't stay out too late, Daddy." Guilt sat heavy in his chest right beside exhaustion. After 12 hours at the garage, a mountain of unpaid bills, and another reminder from his ex-wife that Lily was better off without false hope, the last thing Ethan wanted was to sit across from some stranger pretending he still believed in love. He almost turned the truck around twice. Then he saw the flashing hazard lights ahead. A silver SUV sat crooked on the shoulder of the empty highway, steam curling from beneath the hood. Beside it stood a woman in a dark blue dress, arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold rain, trying and failing to wave down passing cars. Ethan slowed instinctively, then cursed under his breath and pressed the gas again. Not my problem. He was already late, already tired, already carrying more than he could handle. But in the rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse of her standing alone under the storm, and something twisted painfully inside him. 10 seconds later, his brake lights burned red against the rain. Claire Bennett looked up in surprise as the battered pickup reversed toward her. Ethan stepped out without smiling water soaking through his jacket instantly. "Pop the hood," he muttered. She hesitated before obeying. Watching him work beneath the flickering roadside light with rough, grease-stained hands and the kind of quiet confidence that only came from years of fixing broken things. They barely spoke. She noticed the wedding ring mark still faintly visible on his finger. He noticed the sadness hidden behind her polished appearance. When the engine finally roared back to life, relief flooded her face. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan only nodded and stepped back into his truck before she could ask anything else. To him, it was just another forgettable moment in another miserable day. But less than an hour later, when Ethan finally walked into the restaurant he'd been dreading all week, removing his wet jacket and preparing to apologize for being late, he froze, because sitting at the table near the window, staring back at him in complete shock, was the same woman from the side of the road. Ethan Brooks hated blind dates with a level of exhaustion that felt almost physical. To him, they were nothing more than carefully staged disasters disguised as hope. Awkward dinners filled with fake smiles, forced questions, and the inevitable moment when the woman across the table realized he came with too much baggage. A failed marriage, a struggling auto shop, a daughter who depended on him for everything. At 38 years old, Ethan no longer believed people stayed when life became difficult. Experience had taught him that love was conditional, fragile, and usually temporary. The rain pounded harder against the roof of his truck as he drove through the dark highway, outside Chicago windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. The heater rattled weakly while old country music played softly through damaged speakers. But even that couldn't calm the pressure building behind his eyes. His day had started before sunrise with a customer screaming over repair costs, followed by a call from Lily's school nurse reminding him his daughter needed new asthma medication before next week. Then his ex-wife, Melanie, had called only to remind him she couldn't take Lily this weekend because she was busy. She always sounded busy these days. Busy traveling, busy dating, busy building a new life that somehow no longer included her daughter. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He had stopped expecting fairness years ago. Still, there were nights when the loneliness crept in, quietly settling into his chest. After Lily fell asleep when the apartment became too silent and the responsibilities too heavy for one man to carry alone. But even then, he never considered dating seriously again. Not after the divorce. Not after learning how quickly promises could disappear. His best friend Marcus refused to accept that. "You need to move on," Marcus had told him 3 nights earlier while helping close the garage. "You're not dead, Ethan. You're 38, not 80. Ethan had rolled his eyes while locking the tool cabinet. "I have a kid, bills, and an engine waiting for parts I can't afford. I don't have time to impress strangers over overpriced pasta. Her name is Claire." She's smart, successful, and apparently impossible to intimidate, which means she might survive you. Ethan groaned at the memory even now. Marcus had practically forced the date on him after weeks of relentless pressure from both Marcus and Ethan's mother. Eventually, Ethan agreed only because arguing required energy he no longer had, but as the GPS counted down the miles to the restaurant, dread settled heavier in his stomach. He already knew how the night would go. Claire would probably be polished and sophisticated, one of those women with perfect teeth and expensive perfume who talked about travel and wine while quietly judging the grease stains permanently embedded into his hands. Then eventually she'd ask about his life. He'd mention Lily, mention the divorce, mention the garage. And he'd see it happen, that subtle flicker in her eyes when interest turned into polite disappointment. Ethan had seen that look enough times to recognize it instantly, which was why he almost kept driving when he noticed the stranded SUV ahead. The silver vehicle sat tilted slightly near the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain like a distress signal nobody wanted to answer. Most cars sped past without slowing down. Ethan intended to do the same. His headlights swept across the woman standing beside the SUV, and for one brief second he caught the image clearly. Dark hair soaked by rain, one arm wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. Frustration visible even from a distance. She looked out of place there like someone from another world dropped into the middle of a storm. Ethan exhaled sharply and pressed harder on the gas pedal. Not my problem. He had enough problems already. But then the image lingered stubbornly in his mind as the truck continued forward. The empty highway, the rain, the fact that nobody else had stopped. He imagined Lily stranded somewhere alone years from now, hoping someone decent would pull over instead of pretending not to notice. Damn it, Ethan muttered. A few seconds later, his brake lights flared red. The truck slowed, reversed carefully along the shoulder, and stopped behind the SUV. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the steering wheel before stepping into the storm. Rain soaked through his jacket instantly. The woman turned quickly at the sound of his door slamming shut, surprise flashing across her face. Up close, she looked even more exhausted than he expected. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath tired eyes, and her hands trembled from cold despite her effort to appear composed. "Need help?" Ethan asked flatly. She blinked, clearly not expecting someone to stop. "My car just died," she said. "I think it overheated and now it won't restart." Her voice carried a controlled calm that sounded practiced, like someone used to handling stress alone. Ethan nodded toward the hood. "Pop it." She obeyed immediately. Steam rose into the rain as Ethan leaned over the engine compartment. He worked silently while Claire watched him cautiously from a few feet away. The engine smell mixed with wet asphalt and thunder rolling overhead. After a minute, Ethan spotted the issue: a loosened battery connection worsened by water leaking into the compartment. Simple enough. Claire folded her arms tighter. "Can it be fixed?" "Yeah, that's it." Ethan shrugged without looking at her. "That's the answer." Claire frowned slightly. Most men she knew either talked too much or tried too hard to impress people. This man barely seemed interested in conversation at all. He moved with efficient precision, hands rough and confident, every motion practiced from years of labor. She noticed the faded scar near his wrist, the wedding ring mark still faintly visible on his left hand, the exhaustion hidden beneath his stoic expression. Something about him felt closed off, like a locked door nobody had managed to open in years. "You always this friendly?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Ethan tightened a bolt with unnecessary force. "You always question people helping you for free." Claire immediately regretted the comment. "Sorry. Long night." "Yeah," Ethan replied quietly. "Same." Silence settled again. Rain hammered against the hood while passing headlights streaked across the highway. Claire glanced at Ethan's battered truck parked behind them. A child's pink backpack sat visible on the passenger seat. Somehow that small detail softened him slightly in her eyes. You have kids? She asked carefully. Ethan paused only briefly. One daughter. How old? 8. Claire nodded slowly. That explains the backpack. Ethan looked at her for the first time, then studying her expression as though trying to decide whether she was mocking him. But Claire's face remained sincere. She forgot it in the truck this morning, he said. I was supposed to bring it inside after work. Claire smiled faintly. Sounds important. Everything is important when you're a parent. The answer came automatically, edged with weariness. Claire looked away for a second, something unreadable crossing her features. Ethan noticed it but didn't ask. He wasn't interested in stories tonight, especially not from strangers. He reattached the battery cable and motioned toward the driver's seat. Try it now. Claire climbed into the SUV. The engine sputtered once before roaring back to life. Relief flooded her face instantly. She stepped out again, rain dripping from her hair as she stared at him. I can't believe that worked. Loose connection. Ethan grabbed a rag from his pocket and wiped his hands. You should still get the battery checked tomorrow. I will. Claire hesitated before adding softly, Thank you. Seriously. Ethan nodded once and turned toward his truck. Wait, Claire called after him. At least let me pay you. No. Why not? Ethan stopped beside the truck door but didn't look back. Because you were stranded in the rain. Claire frowned slightly at the simplicity of the answer. Most people kept driving. Ethan finally glanced over his shoulder. Most people are tired. The words landed heavier than he intended. Claire noticed the exhaustion in his eyes again, the kind that went deeper than lack of sleep. And you're not, she asked quietly. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. I'm exhausted. For a second, neither moved. Thunder echoed overhead while the storm blurred the world around them into shadows and headlights. Claire suddenly realized she didn't even know this man's name. I'm Claire, she said. Ethan opened the truck door. Ethan. Well, thank you, Ethan. He nodded once more before climbing inside. Claire stood there watching as the battered pickup disappeared into the rain. She expected relief once he left, but instead she felt strangely unsettled. There had been something deeply lonely about him. Not dramatic, not obvious, just hidden beneath every word and movement like an old wound that never healed correctly. Back in his truck, Ethan exhaled heavily and checked the time again. 8:11 p.m. Fantastic. He was now officially late enough for the blind date to be considered a complete disaster before it even started. Part of him considered texting Marcus and canceling altogether. He could still go home, microwave leftover pasta, help Lily finish her science project, and avoid another meaningless evening pretending to be emotionally available. But another part of him, the stubborn, tired part that still remembered what it felt like not to be alone, kept driving toward the city lights ahead. He told himself stopping for Claire meant nothing. Just basic decency, a random moment between strangers who would never see each other again. Yet as rain streaked across the windshield, Ethan found himself replaying the image of her standing beside the highway with quiet determination despite the storm. Unlike most people he met, she hadn't tried to flirt with him or impress him. She looked just as exhausted as he felt, and somehow, that bothered him more than it should have. Meanwhile, Claire sat in her SUV, gripping the steering wheel, staring through the rain at the empty highway ahead. She had almost canceled tonight's blind date 3 separate times already, after her fiancé betrayed her 6 months before the wedding. Claire stopped trusting people who claimed to want forever. Her friends insisted she needed to get back out there, but the idea felt hollow and performative. Tonight was supposed to be another awkward obligation. Another polite dinner with another stranger pretending not to carry emotional scars. Yet somehow the brief encounter with Ethan unsettled all her expectations. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly he tried to leave afterward, as though kindness was something he offered reluctantly, almost accidentally, without wanting credit for it. Men like that were rare, dangerous in their own way, because quiet kindness had a way of slipping past defenses before you realized it mattered. Claire shook the thought away and restarted her GPS toward the restaurant. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere across the city, The man she had spent the last 20 minutes trying not to think about was heading toward the exact same destination. By the time Ethan Brooks finally reached downtown Chicago, the rain had slowed to a cold drizzle that coated the streets in silver reflections. Every traffic light seemed determined to punish him personally. He parked half a block from the restaurant and sat in the truck for a long moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, while exhaustion settled heavily into his bones. Through the windshield, the elegant restaurant glowed with warm, golden light, the kind of place built for polished conversations and expensive wine lists. Ethan already felt out of place just looking at it. He glanced down at his grease-stained knuckles and muttered a curse under his breath. He should leave. That instinct hit him hard enough to almost make him turn the ignition again. But Marcus would never stop harassing him if he bailed, and his mother would somehow hear about it by morning. Ethan exhaled sharply, grabbed his jacket from the passenger seat, and stepped into the cold night air. Inside, soft piano music floated through the restaurant while couples leaned close across candlelit tables. Ethan immediately felt every inch of his exhaustion. The hostess smiled politely when he gave Claire's name and pointed toward a table near the windows. "She's already here," the hostess said. "Of course she is," Ethan thought grimly. He rolled his shoulders once, preparing himself for awkward introductions, and forced small talk, then started toward the table. But halfway there, he froze so suddenly that a waiter nearly collided with him. Claire Bennett looked up from her wine glass at the exact same moment. For one stunned second, neither of them moved. Ethan's brain struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The woman from the highway, the stranded stranger in the rain, sitting here, waiting for him. Claire blinked twice like she genuinely believed she might be hallucinating. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered. Ethan let out a disbelieving laugh under his breath. Apparently not. The silence stretched awkwardly between them while both tried to process the absurdity of the situation. Out of every restaurant in Chicago, out of every possible blind date setup, somehow fate had decided to throw them together twice in one night. Claire recovered first, a nervous smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "So, you're Ethan." "Yeah." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "And you're Claire." "Well," she said slowly, "this is officially the weirdest date I've ever been on." Ethan surprised himself by laughing quietly. It wasn't a full laugh, more like a tired crack in the wall he usually kept around himself. But Claire noticed it immediately. "You should do that more often," she said. "Do what, laugh? You look less terrifying." Ethan raised an eyebrow as he finally sat down across from her. "I wasn't aware I looked terrifying. You pulled over in a thunderstorm wearing a face that suggested you regretted every decision that led to that moment." "That's because I did." Claire laughed softly, and something about the sound caught Ethan off guard. It wasn't forced or overly polished like the laughter he'd heard on previous dates. It sounded genuine, warm, human. A waiter approached the table, and suddenly both of them became hyper-aware of the strange intimacy already sitting between them. Most blind dates started with names, careers, favorite hobbies. But Ethan already knew how Claire looked when she was stranded and frustrated. Claire already knew how Ethan looked while silently helping someone in the rain without expecting praise. Somehow they had skipped the usual performance people wore during first impressions, and that unsettled both of them. Wine, the waiter asked Ethan. Coffee, Ethan answered immediately. Claire looked surprised. "At 9 o'clock, I've been awake since 5. "Rough day." Ethan gave her a look that practically answered the question for him. "Right," Claire murmured. "Stupid question." The waiter left, and awkward silence returned briefly. Ethan glanced toward the window where rain slid slowly down the glass. So he said carefully, "Did Marcus tell you anything about me?" Claire leaned back slightly. "Only that you're stubborn, impossible to impress, and apparently allergic to dating." Ethan snorted quietly. "Sounds accurate. He also said you're a good father." The words landed differently than Ethan expected. Compliments about his work or appearance usually slid right off him, but anything involving Lily hit deeper. "Marcus talks too much," he muttered. Claire tilted her head slightly. "You don't deny it, though." Ethan looked down at the table for a moment. "My daughter's the only thing I've ever gotten right." Claire noticed the heaviness in his voice instantly. Not dramatic sadness, just quiet conviction. Like someone who had spent years blaming himself for things nobody else could see. "That's probably not true," she said gently. Ethan shrugged. "Depends who you ask." The waiter returned with drinks, giving them both a brief escape from the conversation. Claire studied Ethan carefully while he wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. Up close, he looked even more worn down than before. Faint shadows under his eyes, small scars across rough hands, a permanent tension in his shoulders that suggested he never truly relaxed. Yet despite the guarded exterior, Claire kept remembering the way he had stopped for her without hesitation once he made the decision. Most people liked being seen as good. Ethan acted like kindness was simply another responsibility to carry. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. Ethan nodded cautiously. "Why did you stop tonight?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean? You were clearly in a hurry. And honestly, you didn't seem thrilled to help." Ethan looked almost offended by the question. "You were stranded. A lot of people kept driving." Ethan stared into his coffee for a second before answering quietly. "Yeah, they did." Claire waited, sensing there was more beneath the surface. Ethan sighed. "When Lily was 6, her school bus broke down during winter. Blizzard conditions. Phones weren't working right. She ended up standing outside for almost an hour before someone stopped to help the driver." Claire's expression softened immediately. She could have gotten seriously hurt. Ethan nodded once. "After that, I promised myself I wouldn't ignore people stuck on the side of the road." The simplicity of the statement hit Claire harder than she expected. No dramatic speech, no attempt to sound noble, just quiet honesty. "That's actually kind of beautiful," she admitted softly. Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. "Don't make it weird." Claire laughed again, shaking her head. "You really don't know how to take compliments, do you? Not professionally." For the first time all evening, the tension between them loosened slightly. Dinner arrived and conversation began flowing more naturally than either expected. Claire talked about interior design projects and restoring old buildings across Chicago. Ethan admitted he knew absolutely nothing about architecture beyond walls should probably stay standing. Claire smiled. "That's still more practical than most of my clients." Ethan found himself watching her while she talked. Claire had a calm confidence that felt different from arrogance. Even when discussing career success, there was loneliness hidden underneath her words, like someone who had spent too long building a life that looked impressive from the outside, but felt empty when she came home at night. Eventually, Ethan noticed the engagement ring she wasn't wearing, but still unconsciously touched, sometimes twisting an absent spot on her finger when conversation paused. He recognized that habit immediately. "How long ago?" he asked quietly. Claire looked confused for half a second before realizing what he meant. Her smile faded slightly. 6 months. Ethan nodded slowly. "Mine was 5 years. Claire stared at him. "You can tell." Ethan lifted one shoulder. "You still reach for the ring." Claire looked down at her hand almost defensively. "That obvious only to people who've done the same thing." For a moment, the restaurant noise faded around them. The connection between them shifted into something quieter, more dangerous. Not attraction exactly. Recognition. Two exhausted people carrying different versions of the same wound. Claire exhaled slowly. "He cheated," she admitted finally. 3 weeks before the wedding. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm sorry." The worst part, Claire gave a hollow laugh. "Everyone acted like I should have seen it coming. Like somehow being betrayed meant I'd failed some intelligence test." Ethan understood that feeling better than he wanted to. "People love pretending pain is avoidable," he said quietly. Claire looked at him carefully. "What about your marriage?" Ethan stayed silent long enough that Claire thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke without looking up. Melanie got tired of struggling, tired of bills, tired of me working 70 hours a week. His voice remained calm, but Claire sensed the old hurt underneath it immediately. One day she left, said she deserved a better life. Claire swallowed hard, and left Lily too. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. At first, no, but eventually, he stopped himself and shook his head. Doesn't matter. But it did matter. Claire could see it in the way his entire body stiffened whenever he mentioned his ex-wife. Ethan wasn't bitter in the loud, angry way some divorced men became. His pain had settled deeper than that, quieter, more permanent, like erosion. That must have destroyed you, Claire said softly before she could stop herself. Ethan gave a humorless smile. Didn't really have time to fall apart. Lily needed breakfast the next morning. The answer hit Claire directly in the chest. She suddenly understood something important about him. Ethan survived by staying in motion, fixing things, working, parenting, carrying responsibilities until there was no room left to think about his own pain. It explained the exhaustion in his eyes, the emotional distance, the way he kept conversations carefully controlled. Claire looked at him differently after that. Not as the intimidating stranger from the highway, but as a man quietly drowning beneath obligations he never complained about. Meanwhile, Ethan noticed Claire watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Pity usually irritated him immediately, but this didn't feel like pity. It felt closer to understanding, and somehow that unsettled him more. His phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Ethan checked it instantly, every trace of relaxation disappearing from his face. Claire noticed the immediate shift. "Everything okay?" Ethan answered the call without hesitation. "Hey, Bug," Claire heard a tiny voice through the speaker. "Daddy, are you still at your meeting?" Ethan's entire tone softened in a way Claire hadn't thought possible. "Yeah, sweetheart. You should be asleep." "I tried." Ethan smiled faintly despite himself. "Tried, huh? Miss Harper says storms make people lonely." Ethan glanced toward the rain outside before answering quietly, "Miss Harper says a lot of things." Claire watched him carefully during the conversation. The hard edges in his face disappeared whenever he spoke to Lily. His voice became warmer, gentler, protective in a deeply instinctive way. It transformed him completely. "Who are you with?" Lily asked suddenly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "A friend." Claire nearly laughed at the awkwardness of that answer. "A girlfriend." Ethan closed his eyes briefly while Claire tried and failed not to smile. "Go to sleep, Lily." "Okay. Love you." Ethan's expression softened again instantly. "Love you more." When the call ended, silence settled between them once more. But this silence felt different now, softer. Claire stared at Ethan for a second before speaking quietly. "You know," she said, "you become a completely different person when you talk to her." Ethan looked almost embarrassed. "Yeah, well, she's my kid." "No," Claire said gently. "I mean, you actually let yourself feel things." Ethan looked away toward the rain-streaked windows, uncomfortable with how accurately she had seen through him. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, the skepticism. And the emotional walls both of them had built so carefully over the years, something small and dangerous began to form between them naturally, without either one realizing it yet. For the first time in years, Ethan Brooks made the mistake of looking forward to seeing someone again. That realization alone terrified him. It started quietly after the date, small things he couldn't control. Catching himself rereading Claire's texts during lunch breaks at the garage, smiling faintly whenever her name appeared on his phone, wondering what she was doing during long nights spent under broken engines and fluorescent lights. None of it felt safe. Ethan had spent 5 years carefully building a life that depended on nobody except himself. Routine kept him functioning. Work, bills, Lily. Repeat. There was comfort in emotional distance because distance meant control. And control meant nobody could suddenly walk away and leave destruction behind again. But Claire disrupted that balance without even trying. She would stop by the garage unexpectedly with coffee after client meetings downtown, pretending she just happened to be nearby, though Ethan knew perfectly well wealthy interior designers did not casually wander through industrial neighborhoods for fun. She talked to his mechanics like they mattered. She remembered details about Lily's asthma appointments. She listened when Ethan spoke, really listened without trying to fix him or pity him. That was the dangerous part. Claire made him feel seen in ways he no longer knew how to survive, which was exactly why Ethan began pulling away. It happened slowly at first. A canceled dinner because the garage stayed open late. A missed phone call he answered hours later with a tired apology. Text messages growing shorter, more distant. Claire noticed immediately. People who had been abandoned before always noticed the shift first. One Thursday night, Claire sat alone at a small Italian restaurant staring at the untouched candle between them, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Ethan was 40 minutes late. Again. She checked her phone for the third time just as it buzzed. Ethan. I'm sorry. Lily's school called. I can't make it. Claire stared at the message longer than necessary. No explanation beyond that. No promise to reschedule. Just absence. Something cold tightened painfully in her chest. 6 months ago, another man had started disappearing this exact same way before finally confessing there was someone else. Different circumstances. Same feeling. She locked her phone and forced herself not to cry in public. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan sat beside Lily's bed while she slept with an oxygen mask resting softly against her face. The asthma attack at school had terrified him more than he admitted to anyone. One phone call from the nurse, and suddenly every fear he carried came roaring back at once. Losing Lily was the nightmare beneath every decision he made. And tonight, while sitting in the emergency clinic holding his daughter's trembling hand, Ethan realized something that shook him deeply. Claire mattered enough now to become another thing he could lose. That thought lodged in his chest like a blade. After Lily finally fell asleep at home, Ethan stood alone in the kitchen, staring at Claire's unanswered messages. He wanted to explain everything. Wanted to tell her he wasn't ignoring her because he didn't care. The truth was much worse. He cared too much already. His eyes drifted toward the hallway where Lily slept. He remembered the way his daughter had attached herself to Melanie before the divorce destroyed their family. He remembered Lily crying for months afterward, asking why Mommy didn't want to live with them anymore. Ethan had sworn then that he would never let another person walk into Lily's life unless he was absolutely certain they would stay. But certainty didn't exist, not anymore. Claire sat on her apartment balcony that same night, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the Chicago skyline, while silence filled the spaces between her thoughts. She hated how much Ethan's distance hurt. Hated that she had started hoping again despite everything she promised herself after her engagement collapsed. Part of her wanted to call him, demand honesty, force clarity between them. Another part already feared the answer. Maybe Ethan had realized she didn't fit into his life. Maybe he looked at her polished career and expensive downtown apartment and saw someone who could never understand his world. The worst part was that Claire would have chosen his messy reality over fake perfection without hesitation. But Ethan never gave her the chance. Days passed, then another week. The tension between them stretched painfully tight. Built from unspoken fears neither fully understood how to voice. Ethan buried himself in work, pretending exhaustion explained the ache in his chest whenever he thought about Claire. Claire stopped texting first, convincing herself dignity mattered more than chasing someone who clearly kept stepping backward. Yet the deeper their feelings grew, the heavier the silence became between them. Because sometimes the cruelest thing about love isn't rejection. It's meeting someone who feels like home just after you've taught yourself to survive alone. The rain returned the night Claire finally stopped waiting for Ethan to choose her. Instead, she chose him first. She drove across the city with trembling hands wrapped around the steering wheel, the windshield blurred by stormlight and old fears she was tired of obeying. When she reached Ethan's garage, the lights were still on past midnight. Through the window, she saw him alone beneath the harsh fluorescent glow, grease staining his hands, while exhaustion bent his shoulders like the weight of the world had finally become too heavy to carry. Ethan looked up in shock when the garage door opened, and Claire stepped inside, soaked from the rain. For a second, neither spoke. Then Claire crossed the room slowly, her voice shaking just enough to betray how much this mattered. "You don't get to decide for me what I can handle, Ethan." He looked away instantly. "Claire. No." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know you're scared. I know you think loving someone means eventually losing them. But pushing people away before they can hurt you isn't protecting Lily. And it's not protecting you either." Ethan's chest tightened painfully because every word was true. Years of heartbreak, failure, and loneliness had taught him how to survive, but not how to be loved. Before he could answer, small footsteps echoed from the back office. Lily appeared in oversized pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The moment she saw Claire, her face lit up instantly. "You came back," she whispered. Claire knelt down without hesitation, and Lily wrapped her arms around her neck like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then, with heartbreaking innocence, Lily asked softly, "You're not gonna leave, too, right?" Silence crushed the room. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, emotion finally breaking through every wall he had built. Claire held Lily tighter before looking up at him. "I'm still here," she said quietly. And for the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe someone might actually stay. Months later, on another rainy evening, Ethan stood beside Claire outside the garage, while Lily laughed inside, painting the office walls Claire had redesigned herself. A stranded car slowed near the curb, steam rising from beneath the hood. Claire glanced sideways at Ethan with a smile. "You gonna keep driving this time?" Ethan slipped his hand into hers, watching the frightened driver step into the rain exactly the way Claire once had. Then he smiled softly and reached for his jacket. "Not a chance."